This is Big Tasty Sports. It's wild card weekend in the NFL. A very fun time of year as we get to see the fruit of the 18-week NFL season, the teams that have made it. Some of us may even be a little happy about some of the teams that didn't, Packers. But the focus is going to be on the 8 teams playing this weekend. 10 teams, my bad. The 10 teams playing this weekend. And that's going to be the overall focus of today's show. I am going to talk with Yanni about a few of the games, maybe some best bets type stuff. Also about DFS and what might be good moves for your DFS lineups this week. Then I will be going over some of the turnover modeling that I've done and where there might be edges there. And finally, I'm going to do a little bit on the UFC, some round props that I like for Saturday night, though I know the focus will be on football. Before we get into that, I want to just open with this. If you are on gambling Twitter, you know that there is a ton of information out there, a ton of people posting picks, posting statistics, all that kind of stuff. Some of it's good and some of it is less good. And as we get into Wild Card Weekend, where there is increased focus on the NFL, not that we need a lot of increase, it's already very highly focused on, there's only going to be more and more of this stuff out there. And I just want to encourage you to be a little bit careful with what you believe or don't believe and what you put a lot of weight on. And I say this partly because when I started out capping, this was one of the big mistakes that I made. And this is not me crapping on other people. In fact, I'm going to tell you to do the same thing with anything you hear on this show that I'm going to say for other places that you would get information. But I would see somebody post that they had a great record or a trend like I saw today that, I don't even remember what the trend was. There were 3 or 4 different parts to it about road dogs in the playoffs or home dogs in the playoffs. I don't know, something like that. My point is not that these pieces of information are not helpful. In fact, some of them are. But what I would encourage you to do is to really vet them. Think through when you see a trend. Does that trend make sense? Why would that be true? Because if it is true, there's probably some kind of reason for it. Does that go back 20 years? Or is it something that's been more recent, maybe the last 3 or 4 years? Have the teams involved in that trend changed? Or if you see somebody posting about their great record in the playoffs from last year, is this someone you trust? Why would you believe what they're putting out there on Twitter? Maybe it's because you've seen them prove themselves to be trustworthy over time. I have a small number of people where that's true for me, and I absolutely put a lot of stock in what they say on Twitter. But more and more, I just skip over that crap when I see it from most people because I just don't know whether it's true or not. So as you see all this information coming out, and this is true not just for NFL, but overall, I would just say vet it. I mean, there's people like me. At the end of this show, I'm going to be giving you some thoughts on a few UFC fights. Anytime I've talked about UFC, I've been very clear that there are people who know more than I do about UFC. I have been capping it for a while now in terms of trying to find good spots with the process that I have. And so you can take or leave what I have to say. What I would encourage you to do with people who are taking this seriously is listen to what they have to say, find the edges. The reality is that sports books know what they're doing. This is the thing. If anybody tells you there's easy money out there on some kind of play, some side, this team is going to cover for sure. For example, I have the Bengals -5.5, and that line's gone up. But for me to come on here and say, oh, that's an easy winner, it's bullshit. It's not an easy winner. And there aren't easy winners out there. Sometimes after the game, like Georgia, that seems like an easy winner now, right? And maybe in retrospect it is. But the reality is that there were some smart people who were also on TCU. And they underestimated the difference between those teams or whatever. The point is, the books know what they're doing. If you want to bet a side or a total, find information that you think is reliable and actually gives you an edge. And then go attack your spots. Or if you just like to gamble for fun, by all means, throw a few bucks on a team that you like as well. This is going to be the first week where I am going to be focusing on doing a weekly podcast, weekly video that will be on a variety of sports. That'll change week to week depending on what is important at the moment. So, like I said, this week, a couple different segments on the NFL and one short one on the UFC at the end. Let's jump in to some best bets and DFS with Yanni. It is NFL wildcard weekend, and I have to confess that I am a little bit sad. I mean, I love the playoffs, but it also means the end is nigh after a fun season of breaking down games and stuff. But tonight, thankfully, I get to talk once again with Yanni. How's it going tonight, man?
I'm good, man, and I couldn't echo that any better. It's bittersweet when red zone checks off for the final sign off there. It's like it's an emotional time, man. I hear you, but playoffs should be good, so we get a few more weeks of fun here, and hopefully we'll have some successful wagers along the way.
Yep, and then I'll just have to tide myself over with basketball and baseball and stuff until football comes back around. So
There you go. There you go.
yep. All right. Well, hey, tonight we are gonna do a couple things. So, well, and it might be the morning when this comes out, but it's night when we're talking. So, we're gonna talk about some best bets, or at least things that we're looking at or like, and we'll make sure that we are clear on whether we've betted already or just something we're looking at. Then we're gonna actually turn and look at some DFS stuff and some of the implications that could have for prop betting as well. So, something a little different than we've done on the show this year. So, Yanni, if you have something, I'll let you kick it off. What is something that either you've already bet or something that you like right now?
Well, I guess I'll start with something that I already bet, and it's a little contradictory to what you would expect here from, I guess, historical purposes. And what it is I've got San Francisco -10, huge number for an NFL playoff game. You got Brock Purdy making his first playoff start. He obviously only has a handful of regular season starts. So traditional wisdom would tell you, hey, this is a divisional game. It's going to be low scoring. It's going to be close. You got that new quarterback making his start. But I just don't see it here. I mean, these are two mismatched teams. I think, I've been pretty high on San Francisco really all year. But, they've covered 17 points for, what is it, 9 games in a row?
It's crazy.
So, I mean, it's not like they don't have a track record heading in here that they can win by 10 plus points. So, I just think at the end of the day, that defense is going to be too much for Seattle. And obviously they don't have their home field advantage there, which I think is big. Maybe that could have kept that game tighter. I think that eventually they're just going to, it's going to run away with it. It's going to be too much Christian McCaffrey. The Niners are about as healthy as they've been offensively. Samuel came back, got some, able to knock some rust off. So I just think of all the games here, despite the fact that, like I said, historical logic would say you would take the points in this game, I can't do it. I'm rolling with the hot team that's been blowing people out, and I expect them to blow their rival out here again.
Yeah, I'm with you on this, and I have not bet that. I have San Francisco in a teaser. I know we both have a couple teasers that we've put in. I definitely will consider betting them, though. A few things, a couple you mentioned, and maybe another one that would put me on that play as well. Number one is San Francisco getting healthy. I mean, they've been basically missing someone for the second half of the season on and off. And they're not only do they have Debo back and Kittle's healthy, which he has been for a little while. McCaffrey seems to be as healthy as he's been, but they also have gotten Elijah Mitchell back now too, which allows them to take a little bit of, I mean, think of how good Elijah Mitchell was last year. And now he's the backup to Christian McCaffrey. I mean, that's a ridiculous tandem of backs in that backfield. So I think the talent level there is just so high. And then in addition, San Francisco can just take away what Seattle wants to do. I was looking today, Seattle has the second most rushing attempts of any playoff team in their last 3 games. And San Francisco is number 2 in the league in yards allowed per attempt. So they just aren't going to let Seattle run all over them. And Geno, while he's been good this year, and I don't think he's been the whole problem, honestly, like even that game last week, he was under pressure a lot of the time and stuff, but he hasn't been as sharp as he was early on in the year. And his receivers dropped some passes last week and stuff. But I just think there's a real talent discrepancy here, and there's a coaching discrepancy. I mean, Pete Carroll seems to be a decent guy and rah, get the guys pumped up, but I don't think he's a match for Kyle Shanahan when it comes to game planning. So all of those things to me feel like they fall in favor of San Francisco here.
Yeah, too much. I mean, to me, I have this more at a -13 type spread, and quite frankly, I think that again, I mentioned that stat about covering 17 points for 9 games in a row or whatever it is. I to me, this definitely seems like that's going to fall into that category where even if Seattle's able to hang around for a little bit, I think eventually it's going to get away from them. And like you said, if they can't run the ball, I think ultimately that's gonna spell doom for their offense.
Yep. And one other thing, I don't know if this is as true in the NFL. I'd be curious because in terms of betting and stuff, you've paid attention longer than I have just as a fan. But you look at even like that national championship game that was a disaster of a game. I went to bed at halftime in college football last night. But in the playoffs, I have to imagine that teams are going to try to keep their foot on the gas. I mean, you don't want to leave any hope that a team can come and even get that touchdown with a minute left and an onside kick and then tie a game if you're up 14. I mean, I would think you keep the gas down until it's out of reach if possible.
I would think so. And I think you could actually piggyback that by saying it would not be the worst thing in the world if you're a team like San Fran. And again, this is getting way ahead of ourselves, but let's just say that it is 31-7 in the fourth quarter, right? If that were to happen, it gives you an opportunity to, put guys like McCaffrey and Debo Samuel on the bench and Nick Bosa and, get
Right.
those guys a little extra rest, heading into what'll probably be a more challenging game the following week. So, I think you got to factor that in too. Number one, they don't want to take their foot off the gas, but if they can get up enough in the fourth quarter, they'll rest those guys if they can.
Yeah, this might not be around by the time people listen to this, but one thing to consider, and I know you talked about maybe Seattle sticks around for a little while, and I can see that happening, but just another angle you could consider is that first half line, which is all over the place right now. So, like at DraftKings, it's -6.5 at -105, but then Barstool, a couple other places have -4.5 at -120. So you're paying a little more juice, but and obviously the 4.5, you'd like to get 4, but that would be another angle potentially if they can put it on them a little bit and then maybe back off at the end of the game. So
Yeah, I think the last couple seasons we've seen there's been some success when you're taking the dominant team on that first half because you're getting such a better line. Obviously, you only have one half to play with, but it kind of eliminates the back door a little bit. And realistically speaking, if these teams are as far apart as we think they are, and all we're saying is, hey, you got to be up by 2 field goals or a touchdown at half, it almost seems like a no-brainer. So I hear you. I definitely think that's an angle you can consider in a game like this.
yeah. All right, great. So I'm going to go with the bet that I have placed that is not a teaser so far. The only straight bet I have at this point, which I took Cincinnati -5.5. For the purposes of this show, though, it's out to -7 now. I'm going to say that I still don't hate. I think once we get beyond 7, it gets a little iffier because obviously then you can't get the push with a touchdown win. But here's what I would say about this game. Metrically, when I was looking through where these teams are at right now, we know that the Ravens defense has been good recently. We've talked about that quite a bit. However, they haven't been great in getting turnovers. And Cincinnati's offense has been really fantastic, and their defense have stepped up lately. You talked about that last week on Dee's show, how Cincinnati's defense is better than you would expect them to be. To me, like this is very narrative driven, and I promise I do look at a lot of stats and stuff. But watching Joe Burrow last week, and I know that Baltimore didn't probably have their A game, and they'll probably come out with a better effort. But the way that he was moving in the pocket, evading the rush, getting the ball out, it reminded me of Patrick Mahomes type
Yep.
stuff. I think I messaged you guys that, but this like flicking passes, just making stuff happen. I really think Joe Burrow is on another level. I mean, I think he's getting in that category with a Mahomes or an Allen where he's just going to make stuff happen. And with the talent position people that they have around him, even against a good defense like Baltimore, I think Cincinnati is able to still put up 24, 28 points in this game. And then I don't see, I mean, I guess maybe if Lamar comes back and plays, though, -7 to me says he's probably not. Um, I don't see them putting up more than 14 to 17 points here. So if it's a touchdown or less, I like Cincinnati here.
I think you're on the money with that. I've got a few, I guess, additional thoughts there. First of all, I definitely think this is an easy tease spot for Cincinnati. You know, you're
Yeah.
going to get them around -1. And it's hard to imagine, even though these are bitter rivals that play each other tough, it's hard to see Baltimore having enough to win because, like you said, it looks unlikely, at least as of today, that Lamar Jackson's going to play. Now, I have not bet this against the spread yet because of Lamar Jackson news. Because look, he's going to be coming off of 5 weeks. He could be a little rusty. We don't know, but I feel like he gives them a chance to stay competitive in
Yeah.
this game. And I just don't know that Tyler Huntley does. I mean, I know he's stepped in at times and done okay in relief of Jackson, but I think at the end of the day, he's just a guy. He's not Lamar Jackson. And I think you're right. If Huntley plays and this is under a touchdown, I agree with you. I think you got to look in the Bengals' direction there. Again, I'm just kind of waiting to see the injury report. And obviously, if Jackson is announced in, then that line's going to drop. Conversely, if Huntley is announced, I mean, it may go to 7.5, 8, whatever. But I think that you can tease the Bengals here. But I think you brought up another good point. This Bengals offense looks, it's kind of crazy because at times they look unstoppable. And then occasionally they go through a little maybe rough, stretch of a game where they have a couple 3-and-outs or punts or whatever. But for the most part, you're right. Burrow looks like he has full command. It looks like he can take his pick of receivers. They can run the ball enough, to stay honest. That Hayden Hurst is coming back. Obviously, he was injured for a while. He's kind of back in the lineup and in the mix there. I think one thing you can look at here is that Bengals team total. For what you said, we don't know exactly what we're going to get from the Ravens on offense, but I think we do know what we're going to get from the Bengals on offense. And the fact that they've got this game at home, I feel like the Bengals have a little bit of a chip on their shoulder based on the way that whole first seed in the AFC went. And, they've got, it's like they want to kind of stick it and say, you know what, we belong. We are the best. And I like that about this team. I think that you're right. I think you can look at the Bengals here. I think you can absolutely tease the Bengals here. And again, I think you could look at the Bengals point total here.
Yeah, right now, at least on BetMGM, it's 25.5 is the total. So, I mean, you like 26 maybe isn't the most key number that's out there, but having it under 26 isn't a bad thing. With the way some of these points have fallen lately. So yeah, maybe we'll get another coin flip celebration from, was that Mixon who did that? I thought that was pretty clever.
Yeah. Well, Chad Johnson said he's paying for the fine, so you might as well, right?
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, you might as well. Honestly, they shouldn't fine him. They should figure it out. If that's just creative. So
yeah.
All right, awesome. Well, let's see. Do you have one more that you either have bet or are interested in here, or if you have a teaser you feel strongly about that, that works too.
Yeah, and again, these are kind of, I guess, whatever you want to call them, square, sucker, amateur bets. But I think you can absolutely look at some of the favorites here and look at a potential money line parlay. And the three that I have in mind are San Francisco, who we already talked about, Buffalo, and then the Bengals, who we just talked about. You could basically get that 3-team for even money. And there's a reason that parlays generally are not winning bets because something will happen inevitably and whatever. But you kind of look at it being playoff time with everyone focused. You're taking the 3 better teams, all playing at home, all healthier than their opponents. I mean, to me, it kind of lines up and says, even money, I'll take a shot on 3 favorites on a game like that. So that's something that I'm looking at. And just to give you another one, if you're interested, I like the Chargers in this game against the Jaguars. And this contradicts myself a little bit here because I was one that said, hey, if the Jags get into the playoffs, they're playing well, their offense is doing well, that's a team you don't want to play. And I still believe that, but I also kind of feel the same way about the Chargers. And I know we had the little snafu with Mike Williams there and whatever Brandon Staley was doing. And again, you talk about coaching matchups and good Lord, man, I don't know what that guy's doing. But I just think, Jacksonville went into LA and beat the crap out of them to start the season. I mean, they beat them by 4 touchdowns. And I look at this one here and you look at the difference, though. I mean, that game, the Chargers were literally without everybody. Herbert was banged up and they had nobody on their roster. I just think this Chargers offense is going to score a lot. And I think the fact that their defense it's not completely healthy, but healthier than it's been, I think they can get enough pressure on Lawrence to kind of make it uncomfortable for him. So obviously it could be a close game. I think the spread indicates that, but I like the road team here. I think the Chargers just overall are a better team. I just don't think the Jaguars are there yet.
We might have to, people should tune in to the Wager Rager podcast. Maybe we'll talk some more about this game on that one. Cause I would say I'm like 70% through the things that I like to really look at in a game. And I have been sort of anti-Jaguars all the way along. And I'm actually leaning that way right now, but definitely still have some other stuff I want to look at before I go there. I mean, I've said before, I'm not a huge fan of taking a team that's so young in a playoff spot like this where the Chargers have that experience. And I believe in Herbert for the most part. Like, I think he's a really good quarterback. So I agree about it being a close game, honestly. So just that Chargers run game concerns me. We might get to that when we talk about DFS, but
yeah, and look, I will say the sharp money, all signs indicate that sharp money came in on Jacksonville. So the people that do this for a living that move the needle there seem to like Jacksonville. So you're aligned with the right side there. I'm going the other direction here. Something about this game and just Jacksonville going in, and I understand this is Herbert's first playoff game as well. I get it. He's only a year older than Trevor Lawrence, so it's not like he's some veteran guy. But I just think, again, I've talked about this ad nauseum. When you look at the Chargers and the injuries they've had, they were huge, and now all of a sudden they've got most of these guys back, or a lot of these guys back. And you're just seeing a totally different team. We're seeing the team that I think a lot of people anticipated to start the year, and then they just kind of fell off the radar because it's like, Chargers, they got a bunch of guys injured. They're not very good. They're not winning games. And it was fair to assess that. But now we're kind of looking and saying, wait, maybe this is the team that we thought was going to be really good. So I don't anticipate the Chargers necessarily. First of all, let me just say this and we'll wrap this. I think the Chargers can beat anyone on any given Sunday because I think they have enough talent. Do I see them necessarily making a long run here in the postseason? No, because I don't think they're there yet. I think they do have some holes. Coaching, I think, is an issue, as I mentioned there. But I think in this game, I just think that they're going to match up well, with the exception of a guy who I'm sure we're going to talk about, which is Travis Etienne. So anyways, that's my take on that game. We can revisit that one. And I mean, I have a feeling it might be a really good game. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah.
We'll see.
I hope it is. I mean, that's what we want in the playoffs is some good games, right? So
yep, absolutely.
All right. Well, I'm going to throw one more out there and then we will move on to some DFS talk after that. And this one, it pains me to say I have not bet it, and I don't know that I will, but I am considering taking the Giants, especially because it looks like it could be moving toward 3.5. So right now you can get plus threes that are soft. There's a -106, a -105, and then there is one plus 3.5 at -120 out there. What this comes down to for me is, and I've been a little bit of a defender of the Vikings. I've tried to not be insane about it, but to give some context or perspective to some of their losses, because what you see all year is they either win close games or they get blown out in games that they lose. And in those games where they get blown out, it just snowballs on them. I don't really expect that to happen with the Giants. The Giants haven't been phenomenal at taking the ball away. They don't have a ton of weapons, though Daniel Jones has played decent this year, to be honest. This is a rematch of a game that just happened a few weeks ago. I haven't loved what I've seen from Minnesota recently, and honestly, I'm not excited about the coaching at the moment. I know Kevin O'Connell is, people talk about him as a coach of the year candidate, and I'm not like fire Kevin O'Connell or something. Like, let's work into it and see how it goes. But I think a lot of times the play calling is not very creative, and it doesn't feel like you're at least as much as the beginning of the year, like you're getting your best players with the ball in good situations to do something with it. I'm also concerned about Dalvin Cook. I feel like he's slowing down, and that could be injury related. It's hard to know. But often people will talk about running backs not having a long shelf life. And Dalvin Cook has had a really good career with the Vikings, really good. And he's still a good back. But when people talk about the offensive weapons of the Vikings, it's like, oh, they've got Jefferson and Thielen and Cook. And I'm like, they've got Jefferson. Mm-hmm. Thielen looks old. Cook is starting to look old. I actually like KJ Osborne all right, and I like TJ Hawkinson. So I like those other weapons all right, but I don't think it's quite the way people talk about it. And then the Vikings defense is, it's troublesome, but honestly, I think Ed Donatel is troublesome. I get a little worked up thinking about that guy. I mean, at least play aggressive.
Yep.
Blitz, play man coverage, like do something to disrupt the other offense. And Ed Donatel's like, no, we're just going to give them somewhere between 7 and 18 yards at a time until they score. That's kind of our plan. So I think if the coaching was different, I'd feel a little better. I think the talent's okay. But I just think this is probably a close game. I think there's a great chance that Minnesota wins this game by 3 or maybe loses by 3. So if I get 3.5 with the Giants, I am considering taking that.
Well said. I mean, the Vikings as well as anyone, and I agree with you. To me, this is a Minnesota 3-point win. I mean, that's what I anticipate in this game. So I think this line is right on. To your point, would I be shocked if the Giants won by 3 points? No. Again, I think if you are betting it and you're sitting at 3 or it gets to 3.5, I absolutely think the Giants are the better play here. I will say this. I think that, to your point, the Vikings should win this game, but I don't see them blowing this team out. I don't see them blowing anybody out, to be honest with you. I think they've kind of proven that. And
Yep.
I think that this is going to be one of those games, like most of the Vikings games, where it's going to come down to the end. And, probably Minnesota, they're at home. I do think they're still a better team than the Giants. I think they're going to find a way to get it done. But I just can't lay the 3, because to me, this game has push written on it, or, to your point, something happens with the Giants. So if I'm betting it, I'm probably looking at the Giants, but I don't have enough confidence in that Giants offense. And again, I understand the Vikings defense has not been great. I understand that Jones has played well. He's getting a little bit out of some receivers that really probably have no business even starting in this league at this point. But, you mentioned Dalvin Cook slowing down. Saquon Barkley slowed down a little bit in the second half of the season as well.
His carries, man. I just looked at that before we jumped on. They've dropped off a cliff.
Yeah, I mean, they were in, and I don't know. I mean, they were featuring him heavy at the start of the year. And I don't know if it's been more game script. I don't know if it's been intentional. I don't know if it's just been the way it's worked out. I don't know if maybe they wanted to rest him a little bit for the playoffs. But you look at how dominant he was the first half of the season, where you're like, man, this guy, he could be offensive player of the year. And now you start saying, what did he even do in the second half? And he had a couple nice games in there, but it wasn't a lot. So you take that away, and let's just say the Vikings can even remotely contain Saquon. Are you really worried about what else they're doing offensively there? You can't be too worried about it. So I think you look at that. I think the Vikings find enough way. I think they get enough out of Dalvin Cook. I think Jefferson, when needed, makes it happen. And I don't worry yet about primetime Kirk. I don't think this is a spot where, like,
it's
the pressure
Sunday afternoon game. They put him in a nice slot.
but I don't think, I think this is one, though, where the lights aren't too big, right? He's playing a mediocre defense there. One more point. I know I'm kind of bouncing around here, getting a little discombobulated, but one thing that's different about this Giants team, I mentioned Saquon in the second half of the season. The emergence of Kayvon Thibodeau in the second half of the season has been huge, because he went from a guy who was just a guy, right? He was a rookie and he was learning and he wasn't really doing anything on the field. And you look at that Giants defense and you're like, who are these guys, right? I mean, not a ton of huge talent on there. I mean, they got a few good players, but all of a sudden Thibodeau looks like a beast, right? I mean, the last 4 or 5 weeks of the season, he looks like a Parsons, Nick Bosa. I mean, he's had that kind of stretch. And that can totally elevate a defense when all of a sudden you have to account for a guy like that. And it just makes everybody else, the Dexter Lawrences and those kind of players, better, because now all of a sudden, everybody's focused on that. So a little breakout way of saying, I think this Giants defense is going to keep this close, but I'm going to stick with my initial, projection there, which is I think the Vikings win this game by 3 points. I think this line is spot on, and I think the sports books had an easy line to set with this one. I think this was the easiest one for them to set. I mean, honestly, when this came out, I looked at that and I'm like, oh, that's -3. Like that. I mean, literally, that's where my mind went, and it was that easy. And I think the books probably had that same feel on this one. So I think it just kind of tells you that it's dialed in, and at least from a fan perspective, I think you're sitting well, because I think everybody on earth thinks the Vikings are going to win this game by a field goal.
Yep. Well, and you see that with the line potentially moving to 3.5 too. It seems if there's money, it's on the Vikings -3 right now. So,
Right, right.
all right. Well, hey, let's transition to talking some DFS. This should be fun. Not something that we've done together much, but I know something that you put a lot of work into and something I've enjoyed getting into a little more as the season has gone along. So, maybe we can just go kind of position by position. If we bounce around a little bit, that's okay. But talk about just who we like. And obviously, here, we're not only talking about, as people know who play DFS, it's not just who do we think is going to play well, but based on the price, which is
Right.
similar, honestly, to betting in general, because you're looking at the price and the line. So let's start out and talk about quarterbacks, and maybe even stacks with the quarterbacks that you think are ones that you might want to zero in on this week.
Well, so this tends to be for me the weekly question that generally is asked when you're setting a lineup. And that is, where do you want to spend the money at the quarterback position or elsewhere? Obviously, to your point, you can't do both all the time. I mean, when I look at this week, to me, you've got a potential can't miss with Josh Allen in this game. And I will say, we got to preface and make sure weather looks okay when it comes around to game time, because as you know, if they have 20-mile-an-hour winds, that may
Right.
change things a little bit. But the Dolphins are very good at stopping the run. So I don't see the Bills necessarily running the ball a lot. I think they're going to throw in this game. Allen has owned the Dolphins in his career. He's had his best games against them. And I think when you look at the Dolphins' inability to stop the pass, and they've had some struggles with running quarterbacks as well, Allen should have a monster stat line. The problem, of course, is he costs you a fortune. So if you're going to play Allen, where do you subtract there? And that's where you really got to ask yourself if you want him. I would say this: if you are going to play Allen, or you want to play a roster with Allen, I think you can get some value with some of the Bills' lower end receivers. I don't think it has to be Stephon Diggs. First of all, he's going to get Xavier Howard. And not that he won't still probably get a lot of targets, make some catches. He could still have a nice stat line. But I think this is a game where some of these guys who have been a little more disappointing throughout the season, like a Gabe Davis, could show up for you. Obviously, a lot more affordable. I think you could look at a guy like Dawson Knox at tight end, who's more affordable. He's had touchdowns in 5 straight games. I don't know that people necessarily realize that, but he's been finding the end zone, being more involved in the offensive game plan. So I think if you're going with Allen, you can stack that way. But I think to me, there's a couple ways you got to look at the quarterback position here if you don't want to spend the money on Allen, which I certainly understand. I think if you want to go cheap, you can look at a guy like Daniel Jones. He is averaging 19 fantasy points, so he's not that far off some of the big dogs like Allen. He's only, 8 points behind a guy like that. But you don't have to stack him. So if you play Daniel Jones in a favorable matchup against your Vikings defense that has given up some points, some yards, all that stuff, you have money to spend positions. I have to stack with Daniel Jones. So I think you can go inexpensively there. And then I think you have basically 4. I'm naming all the quarterbacks here, but you have 4 other choices here, right? And then I'll turn it over to you. I think you can give Cousins the nod in this game. And I know Cousins is a little bit hit or miss. Sometimes he has those big games. Sometimes he kind of has 101 touchdowns. So you're playing a little risk. But I think you can stack him with guys like Jefferson, spend your money there. A guy like KJ Osborne, who you mentioned, Hawkinson at tight end there. I think you can do that. The other option is to look at that Jaguars and Chargers game and say, do you want to roll with a guy like Lawrence or Herbert, both of who could have nice games? I don't love Lawrence in this game. He's had a good season, especially down the stretch, but I don't necessarily, the last couple games have been a little hit or miss with him. And I don't necessarily love him in this game. So if I were looking at that game, which is anticipated to have some points, I would look at Herbert here because, again, I don't think they're necessarily going to run the ball, but I think they're going to throw it well. So if you're asking me, long-winded way of saying, look at Josh Allen if you want to spend money, look at Daniel Jones if you want to save money at quarterback, and if you want to kind of middle it there, look for a guy like Herbert or Kirk Cousins.
Yeah, I think we're largely on the same page. So my initial take was looking at going to Daniel Jones because of those savings. The thing with him, though, is if I'm going to go to Daniel Jones, I don't know that there's a lot of people I want to stack with him.
Right.
And so I have a little bit this year toyed around with some lineups where I stack a little bit less and try to look for value at pretty much every position, and maybe a little bit in a high scoring game to correlate different people in the same game. I think if I'm going to go with Daniel Jones, I'm looking a little bit more that direction. I mean, you have Bellinger, you have Slayton. I mean, there's a couple people, maybe, I don't know if you have anyone else you would play that's a giant.
Yeah, I mean, Isaiah Hodgins has been a little bit of a sneaky good pick because throughout the last 6 games of the season, he's been at like between 3,100 and 3,800. I think this last week he got up to like maybe 4,000 or 4,100. Still very cheap, but he's basically scored touchdowns every week. I think by default, right? It's like somebody's got to catch a touchdown.
Right.
So, he's kind of gotten in there. But to me, if I'm playing Daniel Jones, I'm probably not stacking at all. I'm looking and saying, I've got Daniel Jones. Now I can get a guy like Jamar Chase. Now I can get a guy like Justin Jefferson. Now I can, make sure I'm playing a guy like Christian McCaffrey. So that's kind of what I'm doing if I'm playing Daniel Jones. And I will say, for whatever it's worth, the number one lineup I had throughout the course of the season was when I had Daniel Jones listed as our fantasy star of the week, and he had a huge game. I had him not stacked with anyone. And, fortunately selected some good expensive options, guys like Jefferson. I don't remember who it was that week, but that lineup, by using Jones as the inexpensive quarterback and using talent around him, worked out great. And I think you could see that again in this wild card weekend.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm with you there, man. And then I definitely was going to say Herbert as well. I think that's a great look. I think a lot of the offense is going to fall on him. And even a lot of Eckler's yards and stuff. Well, I mean, he runs the ball, but it also comes through the air with catches. And so Herbert's obviously getting the points, that at least some points then too, if he's passing the ball. And Herbert can use his legs at times as well. And I think if he's under pressure, he maybe does that a little bit. So I do like Herbert. And then the one other one that I just toy with potentially as a savings, but I don't know if I could get there, is Tom Brady. I mean, Brady has had a rough season in many ways. Their offense has looked a little bit better at the end of the season here. I'm not a full believer, as we'll probably talk about on Dee's show, in terms of how that game maybe goes. But he's got the weapons. He obviously has a ton of experience here. And Dallas is just hit or miss. And so that would be another, he's probably not my first choice, but just another person kind of on my list if I want to try to save some money. And that one with like a money saving stack as well, because obviously I'm probably going to put Godwin and or Evans with him if I play Tom Brady. So
yeah, I think it's a good point. I mean, first of all, Brady has surprisingly thrown for a ton of yards this year. I mean, it hasn't way when you watch this team play. It's looked very laborious, but he's thrown for a ton of yards because they just don't run the ball well.
They can't run it. Yep.
Yeah. So, they, by default, he kind of throws for a lot. And you're right. I mean, the last, well, we'll call it week and a half because they didn't play the whole game this last week, but the last week and a half kind of looked good on offense. And you saw Evans getting downfield and Brady hitting him in stride. And a lot of what I think some people thought going into this season, this team might be. So maybe they're hitting their stride at the right time. I'm going to pass on Brady this week. And look, if Brady threw for 350 yards and 4 touchdowns, I wouldn't be shocked at all. I mean, it could happen, but I'm going to pass on Brady this weekend. I just think that Dallas pass rush is going to make him uncomfortable enough to where he doesn't have that 354 touchdown performance. Could he still have a decent game and put up 275 and 2 touchdowns? Yeah, maybe. I don't think he's a bad option. I don't think there's enough. To me, there's not enough certainty on the upside there. I think it's a little bit too much of a coin flip. I think that it's more certain, to be honest with you, I think Daniel Jones has more certainty this week than Brady. Brady may have a higher ceiling. If you're kind of rolling dice and saying, I want the biggest points, Brady probably has a higher ceiling, but I think the floor is probably higher or equal with Daniel Jones this week, in my opinion.
Yeah, can't disagree. Well, let's talk running backs. Moving on from the QBs, what are you looking at for running backs this week?
Yeah, a lot of good options here. And I think that for me, my flex is definitely running back this week. I just think there's more consistency potentially at the running back position this week as opposed to receivers. Obviously, you're kind of flipping a coin with some of these receivers versus I think some of these running backs. So First of all, if you can get Christian McCaffrey, I think he's at a point now where he was during his peak fantasy, which is you got to play him.
Yeah.
I mean, he's almost guaranteed to get in the end zone. He's almost guaranteed to have, half a dozen catches, get 100 plus total yards. So, I mean, if you have the money, again, if you're playing a guy like Daniel Jones, you can get a McCaffrey in there. But I think the main guy to get in the lineup this week is Travis Etienne. That Chargers running game, and in fairness, it has been a little better the last month of the season, but it's still not good. And I think that he's proven Etienne, especially against defenses, he can shred them. And you look and he played okay against a team like the Titans that can stop the run. But I don't think the Chargers are going to stop him. I think that it's going to be one of those games where as long as the Jags stay committed to the run, he's going to break some nice runs. He's going to get some consistent gains, and I think he's going to find the end zone. So I like ETN in this spot here. I think, he costs, but not a ton. I think he's 6,100 maybe is his price tag on DraftKings, which is not horrible. But the other guys that I think you can look at here, there's one that I like that's sneaky here, and that's Jeff Wilson of the Dolphins. It looks like Raheem Mostert's out. The last time these two teams played, the Bills defense dropped back and basically said, run all you want. And the Dolphins did. And I think that that's going to be, and we don't know who's playing quarterback yet for the Dolphins, but regardless, I think that Jeff Wilson's going to get a lot of totes. I think this is the type of game where he can actually rack up some yards, and he'll probably find the end zone at some point along the way. And he's, I want to say 5,100, I think was his salary. So
5,400.
5,400. Okay. So yeah. So I think you can look at a guy like that and say there's a lot of upside there for a reasonable cost. So those are kind of, I think McCaffrey and ETN are to me not non-misses. I think they're absolutely golden. It's just whether or not you can afford or want to pay them. But to me, again, I like a guy like Jeff Wilson. And one other guy, and I don't like the matchup, which is why I didn't mention him initially, but J.K. Dobbins has looked really good since he's been back, and he's at $5,700. The only reason I don't like him is the Bengals have been really good at stopping the run, and if they happen to get up and kind of take that running element away, he could end up being a non-factor. But I do think at the price, you could certainly look at a guy like that.
Yeah, man, you're hitting a lot of the notes that I would be hitting as well. I mean, McCaffrey is obvious. Etienne is fairly obvious, I would say. I like that J.K. Dobbins play. I mean, I think one of the things with DFS is you have to look at playing some people that other people aren't going to want to play for some reason, right?
Right.
And I think what you said about that game script and that defense maybe make J.K. Dobbins a little less desirable, but I think they have to go to him here. I mean, they've struggled to do anything at running back, whether it's Kenyon Drake or Gus Edwards or whatever, when he's not been in. So I think they have to rely on him. And so is it possible he just gets absolutely shut down? Yes. But if that happens, I think the Ravens get blown out. Yeah. If they're going to be in this game, I think Dobbins has to have a good game. So I love all those. And then I'm going to just throw out two others. And these are ones like maybe if you play multiple lineups, this is something to think about. I don't think these are people that I would put in if I was just playing a couple lineups. And I don't know how many I'm playing, so I may not get to either of these guys, but just of interest. One of those is Elijah Mitchell.
Yep.
He's $4,700.
Yep.
I think, especially if San Francisco can get up in this game, I would think they might want to rest McCaffrey some, make sure that he stays healthy, and then they run the ball anyway. But if they're ahead, I would think they continue to run it even more, and Elijah Mitchell would be the likely person to get those carries. So at 4,700, I think that it has some potential value. And then the other one, and let me look up his cost here. I should have been on that. The other one is Alexander Madison on the Vikings. So he's 5,200, a little bit more. Now, this one is really kind of out there. Dalvin Cook has been banged up this year. He was out briefly in their game against Chicago, and for some unknown reason, O'Connell put him back in. It's another story for another day. But it's not out of the realm of possibility that Dalvin Cook gets banged up here and has to be out for part of this game. Also, Dalvin Cook's been putting the ball on the ground a lot lately, and O'Connell hasn't shown that he's going to like keep Dalvin Cook out if he's got butterfingers. But in a playoff game, maybe that's a little bit more likely. So for Madison, when he got opportunity in that game, and granted, it was against a bad Bears defense, how much do you take away from that? But he's a competent running back. And so you'd have to rely on something happening to Dalvin Cook. But some people are going to have Dalvin Cook in their lineups this week because of the way that he's viewed. And you get some major leverage on those people if something happens and Madison ends up playing. So just a couple players to think about there.
What's really ironic is I was going to add one point to before we moved on. I was going to say, if you're looking for value at running back, I think Eli Mitchell is the guy. So we're definitely aligned there. I think you're spot on. I think this is the type of game where he gets in the end zone. I think he ends up with 15 carries, whatever. So I think at 4,700, he's absolutely a great value play if you're trying to round out the roster. But what's ironic is when I pulled this up, one of the first guys I looked for at running back was Madison. And, I was looking to see where could he be that value guy to round up a lineup and whatever. I just think his price tag is a little too high for what you're getting there. Because again, I look at Eli Mitchell at 4,700, and then I look at Alexander Madison at 5,200. I can't justify, putting Madison for $500 more when realistically Mitchell probably has a higher floor and ceiling. Certainly,
definitely,
floor, maybe not ceiling.
Definitely has a higher floor. No, I agree with you.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, and to play the scenario where Madison has a higher ceiling is a low probability scenario. Right. So that's where I'm saying if you're playing 20 lineups and you put him in one, maybe that would make sense. But
sure,
not more than that probably. So.
Yep.
All right, let's jump to receivers a little bit here. Any overall thoughts on what you might do with receivers this week?
Yeah, and there's gonna be some guys who have really nice performances in this game, right? Or in this wild card weekend. The challenge is, unlike with the running backs, it's a little more hit or miss, I think, with the receivers, and that's usually the case. But I think, I kind of look at who's the sure one. It's probably Jefferson, right? But how much, it remains to be seen how much they're going to throw in this game. And the reason I say that is I think you can run on the Giants. So if they can get Cook and Madison going, whatever. The Vikings, of course, also have other weapons, as you mentioned. So maybe it is one of those games where Jefferson only has 6 grabs for 70 yards, right? Not that, that's horrible, but when you're talking about this, it is. So I don't necessarily love that. I'm looking at more of guys like you mentioned, Chris Godwin. I think this is a great spot for Godwin here. He works primarily out of the slot. The Cowboys have been a little more vulnerable in the slot there. They're playing at home. He's still Brady's top guy that he looks to. I know obviously he tries to hit the deep ball with Evans there, but when he needs a pass, he goes to Godwin. To me, Godwin's the surest thing to catch 7 or 8 passes, right? So, he's going to, again, his floor is pretty high. It's whether or not he can get one into the end zone or whether he can crack that 100-yard mark. That's kind of what you're looking at. But I definitely like a guy like God, this week. I think another guy that's probably he's a little boomer bust, but I like Tyler Lockett this week. Lockett's been one of the most undervalued receivers really all season. I mean, he's averaging almost 16 points a game. And when you look at where he's priced, which is, I'm trying to look here. I don't have any. I think he was at like 6,000, which is, kind of that next tier below the big boys, right? So you kind of look at that. I think that, first of all, Seattle's probably going to be behind in this game. There's a good chance they're not going to be able to run, so they're going to have to throw. And Lockett seems to be the guy. He just gets open. Geno Smith trusts him. So I think Lockett's kind of a sneaky play here. And, to be honest, other than that, I don't necessarily have strong feelings. I like Tyler Boyd in that game is kind of a value play. He's had really good career versus the Ravens. And we know they're obviously going to be trying to shut Jamar Chase down and T. Higgins and that. So I think Boyd could be one of those value plays. And if you want a real big reach here at receiver, if again, kind of to your point with Madison, if you're playing 20 lineups and you want to take a chance here, if you look at my shirt, I think that Cole Beasley, everything I've read is he's going to be worked into this game this week. And I think this is the type of game where, again, Diggs is going to get a lot of attention. End up, if they use him the way they're at least talking about, he could end up having one of those 6 or 7 catches games. He's $3,000. So again, That's if you really want
A
to
lot
make
of
a stretch
savings.
there. Yeah, I mean, or again, you got a whole bunch of heavy hitters in your lineup, and you're like, crap, I only got $3,000 left to spend. Is it possible that Beasley gets you one catch for 7 yards? Absolutely. But again, at $3,000, I'm giving you a super duper sleeper there. I think the real sleeper is Tyler Boyd. But if you want a super duper sleeper, I think you could look at a guy like Beasley here.
I love it. I was actually looking at Beasley earlier and I was like, man, he's not getting many targets, but that's a guy, if he can get some targets, man, he'll get it done. So, and I just like, I like Cole Beasley. So, all right, let me give just a few. I will say, I think somewhat similar to what you're saying. As I have started to look at lineups for this week, I think a lot of my receiver selections will be determined by other things that I do in other places. So, do I want to stack? Do I need to save money? Do I have money to spend? I'm going to talk real quick first about Vikings receivers. So, what I'm curious to see is Justin Jefferson the like show up in the playoffs and have a big game guy? And part of that's going to be if Cousins looks his way a lot or not. So he is like an obvious option, and he does have that ability to do Randy Moss stuff and just go off. And so he does have incredibly high upside. I also don't mind, though, looking at TJ Hawkins. Well, that's when we get to tight end, but he's a receiver, Hawkinson, or even KJ Osborne. KJ Osborne has become the number 2 receiver on this team when they're not just trying to intentionally feed Thielen, which it feels like they're trying to do at times. So I think KJ Osborne, and I should look how much he is.
He's very affordable. I have him here.
I don't know what. Oh, 4,500.
Yeah,
Yeah,
4,500. Yep.
4,500.
Yep.
So he's really cheap, and I think that he has a decent amount of upside in a game like this, especially if they do really focus on trying to take Jefferson away. So that's one. I also like CeeDee Lamb here. I mean, Tampa Bay's defense is decent, but I think that they will do a decent job of stopping the run. And CeeDee Lamb is just another one of these guys where his upside is dramatic. I mean, it's CeeDee Lamb and then major drop off to anyone
Right.
else in terms of receiving options there. So I think, especially in like a one off situation, I think CeeDee Lamb is potentially a good place to look. And then I had one other. Oh, the other person, and this is not someone again super cheap, $7,000, but it goes back to that Chargers game. Keenan Allen, since he's
Right.
gotten healthy, has really been on a roll. And Mike Williams, I'd be a little nervous to play just because we don't know, is he going to make it through the game healthy or not? Don't hate him though. I mean, he's a decent option, but I really like Keenan Allen with what he's done recently here.
Yeah, I should have brought up Allen. You're right, and I think if you do play Herbert, you absolutely stack Allen. I think that's a must. You stack the two.
Love it. All right, let's move on to tight ends.
Yeah, again, it kind of depends on where you want to spend your money. The guy that I'm avoiding, and not because he couldn't have a big game, because he absolutely could, but it's Mark Andrews. The second half of the season, and a lot of it probably has to do with his own injuries and the quarterback issues for Baltimore, but he's basically disappeared. So I think, you kind of eliminate a guy like that. Kittle has really improved since Brock Purdy's been there, but for me, it's just a little too much money there. I'm kind of going that next tier down. I think Hawkinson's the play here. I like him inside here. I think he has a solid matchup against the Giants. So I like Hawkinson. I think Gerald Everett is a potential play. Again, if you're playing Herbert, I think you can stack a guy like Gerald Everett there. He's been pretty consistent as far as getting 4 or 5 catches, 50 yards, that kind of performance. And he's gotten in the end zone a little bit. So I think he's an option. And I mentioned earlier, Dawson Knox, he scored in 5 straight games. I think he's a guy that's just become more and more involved in the offense. Josh Allen trusts him, especially in the red zone there. So I think those are kind of the 3 that I'm really looking at there. If you want to go cheaper, you can look at a guy like Cade Otton. He's a guy that, Brady kind of looks to a little bit. He hasn't necessarily put up huge numbers, but I think he gets the snaps to merit a look if you need to save some money there. But I think you can absolutely get some value with a guy like Dawson Knox. I think you can look at Dalton Schultz as well, although I don't love him in this spot. I mean, he should catch some passes in this game, but I think for me, I'm looking at Hawkinson, I'm looking at Knox, and I'm looking at Everett here.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, there's a way that you can make a case for quite a few of these guys, right? And that's sort of tight end. It's more volatile,
Right.
especially it's very tight end or touchdown driven. Do they get into the end zone? That makes a huge difference. So I personally, the one of the guys I want to stay away from here is George Kittle, and he has come back and been doing better, but I think some of that is driven by their injuries on offense. And I think with them having the full complement of players back, it'll be interesting to see. I mean, maybe Purdy will continue to get him the ball, but I think his usage could go back down now, especially with Deebo Samuel back. So I would look away from him. I do like TJ Hawkinson for sure. I like Knox, who you mentioned quite a bit. So those are two that I would definitely look to go to. And then I like Kate Otten as well, especially at that price. One more thing about him, and then I'll say my one other person I might look at. Watching some of that Bucks game last week, like you said, I think Brady's looking for him a lot. And there were a couple poorly thrown passes that he almost caught. There was one that he dropped it was thrown hard, but it was right to him and he dropped it. But it seems like they are trying to incorporate him more and more into the offense. And he, to me, feels like one of those guys that is a little bit due to have a really big week. Like if he starts hitting on some of those catches, and if a defense is focusing on those receivers, I actually think his ceiling is really high given his price. So I do like Kate Otten a lot. And then the other one for me is potentially Isaiah Likely with the Ravens, just because of what you said with Mark Andrews. And if they focus on him if they do have to throw, Likely's been getting a little more usage, and he also is cheap. So again, potential upside in usage for a guy that is pretty inexpensive.
Yep.
So last and least, any thoughts on defenses?
No, in some weeks there are defenses where you're like, man, this either seems like a good value, or man, I'm going to play that expensive defense because they're just going to throttle someone. I don't necessarily. I think defense is always a little bit of a crapshoot here. I think when you look at kind of the value, I think you could make a case, like I'm kind of looking at that Buccaneers and Cowboys game there, just because I think those teams, it's going to be a lower scoring game. I think that we could have some sacks in that game, possibly some turnovers. So, I mean, I think you can look at that, but realistically, I can't make a strong case for anyone that I love here. Now, I will say, if for whatever reason Skylar Thompson gets the nod for the Dolphins, I think at that point you could justify spending the money for the Bills defense. If Bridgewater or Tua get the nod, I probably wouldn't spend for them at that point. But if Skylar Thompson goes, maybe. The other one there is potentially the Bengals there. If Lamar Jackson is in fact ruled out, I think at home they played obviously great defense this last week against Anthony Brown. But I think against Tyler Huntley, they can, kind of do a similar job there. So I think the Bengals are a team you could look at there. The 49ers should be great, obviously, but I can't justify spending an extra $1,000 on a defense that, may get you a couple extra sacks or whatever along the way. I mean, a lot of times with these, and this is kind of the frustrating part about DFS in general, a lot of times you can have a good lineup and one team that you don't have has 2 defensive touchdowns, right? Or something. Yeah. And it's like, you're almost eliminated there. So really what you have to do, in my opinion, is you got to do the best fitting in of the defense that you can based around your other players, and hope for the best, and hope that one of these other defenses, hope that the Niners don't pick Geno Smith off 3 times and take it to the house, right? That's kind of what you have to have happen here. So anyways, that's a long way of saying I don't really have any strong feelings. I think you can look at the Bengals and, just do what you got to do.
Yeah, so I don't have really strong feelings either. I, with defense, tend to be like, which of the bottom 3 defenses do I like the most?
Pretty much.
I will say I do have just a little bit of a thought here, and the reason why is because of all this ridiculous, stupid work I'm doing around turnovers, probably, but really diving into, obviously, if you can get a defense to get turnovers, that's going to provide you with more points. And one of the places that I would consider looking this week is to the Buccaneers. The reason why is Dallas, when I've looked at ratings based purely off of turnovers, out of all the playoff teams left this week, on the season as a whole, I have them ranked number 10 out of 12. And in the last 5 games of the season, I have them ranked number 12 out of 12 in terms of how they're doing offensively in relation to turnovers. And so does that mean they're going to turn the ball over this week? Of course it doesn't. But Dak does like to throw a turnover now and then. He has at least one pick in 10 out of the last 12 games. So he's generally throwing a pick. And if you get a pick, maybe you get a pick six, right? Like when we get to defense, it's kind of a crapshoot anyway. And Tampa Bay is the third least expensive defense this week.
Right.
So if I was going to look somewhere, that might be it.
No, I'm with you on that. I think you bring up a great point. And they also mentioned, I think it was during Sunday Night Football, maybe they were talking, or one of the broadcasts, and they said, if you notice, the point production for Dallas on the road on grass goes way down compared to at home and on turf. So obviously they slow up a little bit on turf or on grass. And I know that Dallas is very volatile. They can put up 45, they can put up 12. We get a lot of variance with Dallas there. But I think you're right. I think, when you look at that price, I guess I would agree with you in the sense that I'm not paying for a San Francisco. I'm not paying for a Buffalo unless Skylar Thompson's in, because then you have a realistic chance to really rack up some points. I think you're right. I think you look at more at a team like Tampa here because of that turnover. I think you're right on the money there.
Awesome, man. Well, thanks for jumping on tonight. This is fun. I'm looking forward to hopefully great weekend of NFL football. It will be a wonderful thing if not only you can celebrate a Buffalo win, but maybe I can get a Vikings win, at least in the first round too. Before we get out of here, just why don't you talk a little bit about what you've got going on this week and remind people where to find the stuff you're doing.
Yeah, find us on Twitter at the Bet Crushers or betcrushers.com. I'm actually working on it now. I'll have an article basically kind of previewing all the games, including some betting angles. And I'll also have kind of some DFS, a little bit of what we talked about, some players I'm looking at, probably a sample lineup or two that I'm putting out there. So good luck. I hope you're right. I think we're both going to get it done this week. I'm crossing my fingers. I think we'll be on to the divisional round. So let's hope for the best.
Sure hope so, man. Hey, thanks for chatting. It was a lot of fun, and have a great night, man.
Always appreciate it, man. Take care. We'll talk to you soon.
Next up, we're going to talk about turnovers and the impact that they could have on this weekend's wild card round games. I've been looking at turnovers in some more depth the last 4 weeks. Part of really the whole reason is that turnovers have a tremendous impact on who is likely to win games. Now, turnovers could be difficult to predict. There's a lot of things that can go into them, along with some luck factor. But there are a lot of things in the NFL that are hard to predict. And I think now is the time to be diving into this because we have a full season sample size. Just to highlight the impact of turnovers before we get into the specific games, if you win the turnover battle by 1, you have about a 73% chance of winning a game. So you go from 50-50. Now, I know not every game is 50-50, obviously. But on the whole, you go from 50 to 73. If you win that turnover battle by 2, you go up into the 85 to 87% range. So we can talk about a lot of factors that influence games, but turnovers are a big one. So what I did is I built a turnover model, and it has a number of components. I'm going to go over those briefly. If this kind of stuff is boring to you, feel free to skip ahead just a minute or two, where I'll be getting into each of the games coming up this weekend and what the model says in terms of turnovers for these teams. But there were a few things I wanted to account for here. Number one, I wanted to break out the difference between interceptions and fumbles. Fumbles are not always recovered. So if you only look at turnovers, what you're getting is interceptions. And I know you can have dropped interceptions or interception possibilities. So I get that there's some variance there as well. But with fumbles, really, if you fumble, you're giving an opportunity for the other team to get it. So, right or wrong, what I did in this model is I included interceptions and I included fumbles, not fumbles recovered by the other team. And I broke those out individually and then also did some metrics where I put them together. The other thing is, I don't want to just take turnover differential for the season overall because there's so much variance game to game within that. So I took this model accounts for turnovers a game at a time, and it rates either 0 turnovers, +1, -1, +2 or more, -2 or more. And then it correlates the estimated win percentages based on those different levels of turnovers to what the teams have done throughout the season. And so I took all of that data, and I'm not going to walk through every step of the model. I think for most people, that would get pretty boring. Plus, I'd have to pull up some spreadsheets and walk you through a step at a time the way that I built it out. But basically, I wanted to make sure that you understand the factors that I'm accounting for here. There's one final one that I didn't mention yet, and that's the full season versus recent performance. This one gets a little bit tricky because obviously a bigger sample size is better. And even a full NFL season is not that big of a sample size. It's 17 games per team, or 16 in the case of the Bengals and the Bills. So that's not that big in and of itself. However, I do think it matters what's going on with a team now. And there are some teams where there's pretty dramatic differences. For instance, Tom Brady, I mean, I'll get to this, and I'm going off memory, but I think he threw one interception in the first 12 games and then has 4 or 5 in the last 5 games, something like that. So I wanted it to account for both recent performance and season long. So what I did is I took season long metrics for all of the things I've been talking about, and then I also did the last 5 games each team has played. Oh, one other aspect of this. I looked at offense and defense separately, not just the team overall. So I looked at, for instance, Seattle's offense. How do they perform in relation to turnovers? And then Seattle's defense. How do they perform? And so as we go through this, I'm going to share with you the matchup in each game between one team's offense and the other team's defense and vice versa. And then I'll give you an overall rating as well, which it's probably a little bit dramatic or indulgent, to be honest, but I called it a super rating. And all I mean by that is I took every single component of what I've just laid out for you and wove that all into a single rating for each team. So I'm going to walk through some of the individual components, and then I'll give you that super rating. And I think we do see some opportunities here where the difference in these turnover metrics is worth considering. I want to say up front, this is absolutely not the only thing you should consider. I mean, if I wanted to be this kind of Twitter tout, I could just go put these ratings out there. And I did put these ratings out there, but say it's obvious who you should pick this weekend. Well, no, it's not obvious who you should pick this weekend. But I think that this is a component, if you take capping seriously, that most people are not looking at. And I'm not sure how heavily the sports books weigh this. So like I said in the open, if you're looking for edges, I think this is one place where potentially you could find some edges, but it needs to be part of a larger capping process, not something that stands on its own. All right, that's the preamble, y'all. Let's get into the freaking games here. First up, we got Seattle against San Francisco. Seattle's offense, I have rated, and I did these ratings and then ranked them out of the 12 playoff teams. So this is not out of all the teams in the NFL for the whole season. I just ranked them in relation to the other playoff teams from this week. So I have Seattle's offense ranked at a 63, and the offensive and defensive metrics come out differently because of the way that win percentages play out in relationship to turnovers. So like I have San Francisco's defense at 141 and Seattle's offense at 63. You can't compare those two. Those are apples and oranges. You can compare offense to offense and defense to defense, which is why I gave these ratings as well. But I think the numbers could come into play over time, and I want you to see those differences. So at 63, Seattle's offense is number 9 out of 12 offensively in relation to turnovers, while San Francisco's defense is number 3 out of 12 in relationship to turnovers on defense. And that's for the season. When you look at the last 5 games, Seattle has been slightly better. They go from 63 to 66 at higher ratings or better on this scale. And they move up from number 9 to number 6 out of these 12 teams. But San Francisco's defense goes from 141 to 151, and they go from a number 3 ranking to a number 1 ranking when you look at the last 5 games. So they have been incredibly strong in relation to turnovers. Now, when we flip sides of the ball here, San Francisco's offense rates out at 71 for the season, which is number 3 out of the 12 teams. And Seattle's defense at 136. Now, this was a little bit surprising to me, and I do think you kind of want to look for opportunistic defenses in the playoffs because you get a couple turnovers, and even in a mismatch, you start to have an opportunity to win. That's number 3 out of 12 on the season. Oh, actually, it must be number 4 out of 12 because I have Seattle and San Francisco's defense at number 3. I messed one of those up. So San Francisco is actually slightly better. But there's a pretty dramatic shift that happens when we go to the last 5 games. San Francisco's offense goes from 71 to 86. They move from number 3 to number 1. Well, what changed? Brock Purdy took over as quarterback. I know it's not maybe only 5. I'd have to go check. It's not much more than 5 games. Maybe it's 6. And so while he is young and you worry about that in the playoffs, he has been incredibly efficient in running this offense without problems from turnovers. On the Seattle defensive side, they go from 136 to 117 when you look at the last 5 games, and from number 3 or 4 to number 11. So their defense drops off a little bit of a cliff in relation to their strength in relation to turnovers in the last 5 games of the season. So overall here, there's a fairly significant mismatch between Seattle and San Francisco. That's true in many facets of the game. I think people see that already. But I would add what the turnovers tell us about these two teams to the pile. In terms of super ratings, again, taking everything into account, San Francisco has the highest super rating of any team in the playoffs at 1,121. Seattle is number 9 out of the 12 teams at 955. So this is another metric where there is a substantial difference between these two teams. And it would push me further towards San Francisco. Again, wouldn't use it as the only thing that I use to cap this, but for whatever it's worth, it says San Francisco. Next up, hopefully you're getting a sense of sort of how these numbers work and how the rankings work as we move on to the next game, which should be a fun one on Saturday night, the Chargers and the Jaguars. In this one, we have the Chargers offense on the season at 67 points on this scale, number 7 out of 12, and Jacksonville's defense at 135, number 4 out of 12. There's not a massive difference for the Chargers offense. They go from 67 to 69, so they improved a little bit when you look at the last 5 versus the season. But Jacksonville's defense had a significant improvement from 135 to 148. That only bumped them from number 4 to number 3, but a strong improvement in the last 5 versus the whole season. And a little bit of an advantage, I'd have to say, for Jacksonville, though not massive. When we flip over to the other side of the ball, Jacksonville's offense comes in at 70 points, which is number 5 out of 12, and the Chargers defense 133, which is number 6 out of 12, which, you know, the Chargers defense is a little bit of a concern, but they come in right in the middle of the pack in relation to turnovers here and giving their team opportunities with turnovers. But Jacksonville's been decent. Now, in the last 5, Jacksonville did drop from 70 to 67, but stayed at number 5. And the Chargers went up a little from 133 to 135, but they also stayed at number 6. So that's a pretty even matchup there, not a massive discrepancy. In terms of the super rating here, the Chargers come in 4th out of the 12 teams at 1,007, and Jacksonville comes in at number 2 out of all 12 teams at 1,049. So they're not way above the Chargers, but this is something that I am taking into consideration as a piece of information that pushes a little bit toward Jacksonville. And I think there are some other things there. I'm going to save that on D's podcast. There's some beeps from my email. Maybe we'll blot those out. Maybe we won't. We'll see. Depends on how I feel about it. If so, you just know I'm getting some email, which is important for you to know. All right, that wraps up the Chargers and the Jaguars. Next up, a game that, man, maybe there's not a lot to read into it anymore. It's the Dolphins and the Bills. We know Skylar Thompson now is going to be starting for Miami. Just, I don't know how much there is to say here. I'll give you the numbers quick, but this, aside from some, I mean, honestly, the thing that could keep Miami in this game is turnovers. I think if they don't get turnovers, they're screwed. So where are they at? Well, their offense comes in at 67 points for the season, the same as the Chargers, tied for number 6. Buffalo's defense, 131, which is number 7. So, meh. In the last 5, not massive changes. Miami's gone from 67 to 64, gotten a little bit worse, and Buffalo from 131 to 138. So they've gotten a little bit better. Moved up actually to number 5 in the rankings in the last 5. On the other side of the ball, Buffalo's offense, this is where it's interesting to me because, like I said at the beginning, what keeps Miami in it here is turnovers. Well, Buffalo's offense comes in with 57 points, which is number 12 out of 12 teams in relation to turnover metrics on the season. They're the worst of these 12. However, Miami's defense comes in at 123, which is also number 12. So we have weakness against weakness when it comes to the turnovers here. In the last 5 games, Buffalo's gone from 57 to 61, moved up to number 8, but it's only a slight adjustment. It's a little bit better. And Miami's defense also improved a bit. They actually dropped in their number from 123 to 119, but ranking went from number 12 to number 9. So the reality is that it's possible, I think, that Buffalo would give Miami opportunities for turnovers, but what this says is I'm not sure Miami can take advantage of it. The super rating, Miami's number 11, just really not good, 934. Buffalo's number 6 at 969. So actually in the super rating, a little bit of an advantage to Buffalo. Also, just a couple points to make here. Buffalo has forced at least 1 fumble in 9 of the last 10 games. That's really strong if they can keep that up. And Miami has had 1 or more fumbles in 4 of their last 5. So some to watch for if Buffalo could force a fumble or 2 in this game against the Dolphins. Though with Skylar Thompson playing, I don't think they really need it. All they need is to not turn the ball over 3, 4, 5 times themselves. On to my Vikings, playing against the New York Football Giants. Man, I think turnovers are big in this game. And maybe it's just because I watch the Vikings more, but they cannot afford to turn the ball over. They're not good enough to overcome it. The Giants may not be either, for whatever that's worth. The Giants on offense, interestingly, come in with 71 points, which is number 2 out of these 12 playoff teams. So they've been strong offensively when it comes to turnovers. Really good. Daniel Jones has not turned the ball over a bunch. They're not fumbling a bunch either. Minnesota comes in with 130 points. That's number 8. So bottom third. Last 5 games, Giants have kept it rolling. 71 points still number 2. Minnesota's dropped a bit to 127, but stayed at number 8. So the advantage is definitely with the Giants when it's the Giants offense versus the Vikings defense. I would not look for a ton of turnovers there. In fact, I didn't throw this in anywhere else in the video, so you might want to look if you can get a good line on Daniel Jones under 0.5 interceptions. Those lines hadn't come out last time I checked, but if it's a good number, that's something I'll be considering. Other side of the ball, Minnesota's offense on the season, 65 points. That's number 8 out of 12 teams. So they were number 8 on defense. They're number 8 on offense. Not good in regard to turnovers on either side of the ball. However, the Giants defense comes in with 125 points, which is number 10. So their defense has not been taking the ball away either. Now, Kayvon Thibodeau has been playing better, and I think they're getting a couple defensive backs back. So that could make a difference. Last 5 games, Minnesota's been even worse. They dropped from 65 to 54 points, now 10th out of 12. And the Giants went down also from 125 points to 117, though that kept them at number 10 overall. Super ratings on these 2 teams, the Giants come in at number 7 with 961 points, while Minnesota comes in at number 10 with 939 points. Not only is Minnesota's defense pretty terrible, but they are in the bottom 3 for the impact of turnovers on teams that are in the playoffs. And that is another thing that does not go in their category. Interesting here, just a couple things. The Giants have 10 games without a pick. So that like I said, Daniel Jones has been doing, I'm sorry. Let me get this right. They have 10 games without a pick. In other words, their defense has not had an interception in 10 games. But they also have 10 games where they have not thrown one. So maybe they don't pick Cousins off, and that could keep the Vikings in the game. But also, they're not likely to turn the ball over through the air. Also, Dalvin Cook had 1 fumble in his first 12 games. He has 3 in his last 5, and they have been in important situations for the most part. That is troubling. So, if we're going to pick a side based on what turnovers say about a game, you have to put a check mark on the Giants side of the ledger for this one. Next up, we have Baltimore and Cincinnati. It looks more and more like Lamar may not be playing. I say that only because of the line, not because of any information that I've seen. I was just going to double check here. Yeah, the Bengals are up to -7.5. So it feels like that trends toward Lamar not playing. Let's talk turnovers. Baltimore's offense, 62 points, number 11 on the season. That's surprising to me. They have really not been good when it comes to turnovers offensively. Or I'm sorry, that's Baltimore's offense, which is less surprising, especially with Lamar out a lot. So yeah, not good. Cincinnati's defense has actually been okay. 133 points, number 5. So number 11 versus number 5. If you drop down to the last 5 games, Baltimore has actually gotten worse in terms of the numbers from 62 to 57. Their ranking has gone from number 11 to number 9. So a lot of these teams getting worse in the last 5. Cincinnati's defense went from 133 to 143. So a really good increase and moved up to number 4. So there is a definite advantage Cincinnati defense versus Baltimore offense when it comes to turnovers. Cincinnati's offense, this is less surprising, number 1 when it comes to offensive metrics related to turnovers with 73 points. They did drop down to 70 in the last 5, which moves them to number 3, but still that's strong in terms of offensively what they're doing with turnovers. Baltimore's defense, I thought, would be really high, but they come out with 130 points, number 9. And when you go to the last 5 games, they drop from 130 to 117 and go all the way down to number 12 out of 12 teams. This is another game, sort of like the last one, where I think Baltimore needs turnovers to stay in this game. And this tells me it's just more likely that they won't get them than that they will. Obviously, turnovers happen in all kinds of different games, so we can't predict it for sure. It's the whole point. If you can just get an edge, you're not going to get anything 100%. But it leans towards Cincinnati here, and that's true with the super rating as well. Baltimore, 913 points, number 12 in the super rating. Cincinnati, 1,046, number 3, one of 4 teams above 1,000. So a definite advantage here when it comes to the turnovers for Cincinnati. Another thing you might want to put in their column, and 7.5 is getting a little bit wide, but I think there's a lot, turnovers included, that could push towards Cincinnati here. All right, the last game, Dallas versus Tampa Bay. This will be on Monday night. Should be interesting. What do we get from the turnovers here? Well, Dallas's offense has 63 points. They are number 10. And in the last 5 games, they go from 63 to 45, just brutal, all the way down to number 12. Tampa Bay's defense has not been good in this metric, 125 points, which is number 11 on the season. A little bit better, though, recently, up to 135, which is number 7. And it's worth noting that they have been getting more healthy, especially in the secondary. So I think that this is one of those spots where I think there's something to recent numbers versus season long because Tampa Bay has had so many injuries. Now, 135, number 7 out of 12 is still not phenomenal, but it puts them in a decent range rather than a terrible range. Other side of the ball, Tampa Bay's offense comes in with a 70, which is number 4, but all the way from 70 down to 54 points in their last 5, number 11. I mentioned about how Brady has had more picks. So he had 2 picks, I believe, in the first 11 games, and then 7 picks in the last 6. It's actually worse than I thought it was. And Dallas's defense has at least 1 pick in 6 straight games. Now, a little deeper dive, if you go look at the actual numbers, Brady has gone back to having 0 picks the last 2 weeks, though he only played half of the game against Atlanta. So is he getting in sync with the receivers a little better, and maybe he'll stay away from the turnovers? It's possible, but I'm just telling you the turnover metrics got worse for Tampa Bay in their last 5 games. Dallas's defense on the season is number 1 in this metric with 142 points. They went all the way up to 150 in the last 5, which still ranks them number 2, but really strong. So there's a decided advantage when it comes to turnovers for Dallas's defense versus Tampa Bay's offense. And then on the other side, I would say maybe there's a slight edge for Tampa Bay's defense versus Dallas's offense. I think this is a game where potentially you look at turnovers on both sides of the ball. I think that's a real possibility, and that could throw who wins up in the air a little bit. The super ratings, Dallas is number 5 with 998, and Tampa Bay is number 8 with 960. So that says a little bit of an advantage to Dallas. I will say Dak has had at least one pick in 10 of the last 12 games, but Tampa Bay has had 9 games this season with 0 picks. So they have not been the ones to take advantage of it. Now, if they're healthier, can they do it a bit? I think so. We will probably talk more about this game. I think if Dallas can win the turnover battle, they win this game. But if Dak goes out and throws a few picks, I definitely think Tampa Bay can sneak in here and get the win. What I want to end this segment with is just a few props you could consider looking at. I have not bet any of these, partly because they weren't out. I want to see what the lines are before I bet them. So these are not things I've taken. Just telling you based on all of these metrics, it's things you might want to consider. To throw an interception, Brady, Dak, and Geno are ones you might want to look at to throw an interception. Geno has at least 1 in 7 of his last 10 games. And in their last 9, San Francisco has 1, 2, 0, 3, 2, 0, 1, 2, 3 in terms of picks. So Brady, Dak, and Geno are ones that I would look at to throw a pick. People to go under, one of these that I mentioned before, but people might not have thought historically, is I'd look at Daniel Jones and Brock Purdy to go under half an interception potentially based on the way that they've been performing and the defenses that they're going against. That is it for what the turnover metrics tell us about the wild card weekend, and I hope that that can be a helpful part of your process. All eyes will be on the NFL this weekend for the wild card round. However, after a 4-week, I believe, hiatus for the UFC is back with a UFC Fight Night. Imavov with a short notice replacement. Sean Strickland stepping in for Kelvin Gastelum. If you know me, you know that I really like UFC and have gotten into it relatively heavily over the past couple years. I do not have a background in mixed martial arts of any kind, and so all of my knowledge comes from just watching fights over the last 2 years, listening to a lot of people who are smart. What I'm gonna do today is I'm gonna go over 4 fights where I like a specific round prop for this weekend, and I'm gonna talk to you about why. And I will say up front, go listen to the people who are super smart on this stuff. If you follow me on Twitter, I comment like a lot of people's stuff many times. I try to put out there periodically people that I'm listening to. There are a lot of good people out there who can break down a fight and get into the specifics in ways that I try to with NFL or NBA or things like that, but I'm just a little less knowledgeable in UFC, and I want to be upfront about that. However, the reason that I am going to go through some of this stuff is I do think that there is stuff that you can bring to capping where I think I understand the fights well enough to understand some of the important issues to look for, and I'm able to look at line movement and find where there's value and different things like that. So all that said, I want to hit you with 4 round props that I like. Again, these are not out yet. So sort of like some of the interception props I talked about in the turnover segment of the podcast, I have not bet these yet. And whether I do or not will depend on what the line is. And if I think it's valuable enough to bet, you never know until it comes out. So the first one is going to be Priscilla Cachoeira, round 3 KO, going up against Sarge Eubanks this weekend. Now, I'm going to back off of betting women's fights, I think, a little bit this year. I'm going to have to be pretty strongly convinced to bet favorites in women's fights. Part of the reason is that they tend to go to decision a lot, and the judging is just all over the place. I feel like if it goes to the judges, it's just a crapshoot unless it's absolute domination. And many times women's fights are not absolute domination. So women's MMA isn't something that I'm rushing to bet in general. And like I said, many times women's fights go to decision. In fact, I bet this fight over 2.5 at plus 160. That line has moved now. I think there's a decent chance this fight could go to a decision. I mean, both of these women are durable. And so I think they both could hang in there through the whole fight. However, depending on what the number is, I think there could be value on Priscilla Cachoeira around 3 KO. Here are the reasons why. Number one, at times Sarge Eubanks gasses. Eubanks is likely to be going for some takedowns if she gets them. Brandon Olivas had a great thing on his podcast with oh Lordy, I'm gonna get killed for Santino DeFranco. There we go. On those two guys' podcasts this week, he had a great thing about how he said, I can go forever striking, I can go forever grappling, but make me go back and forth between the two, and I'm gonna wear out. I think that is applicable to this fight, and I thought was a great insight. So shout out to him for that. Eubanks is going to be going for takedowns if she gets them, but if Cachoeira is able to get back up, I think it's very possible that by the middle of the second round, Eubanks starts to gas out. Priscilla Cachoeira, I don't know if it would matter if she did gas out. Some people call her zombie girl because she just comes forward and continues throwing. She gets hit in the face a lot, but she throws right back, and she does have some power, and you're going to have a really hard time getting her out of there. So I think the chances of her getting finished are fairly low, and if Eubanks is gassing out by the third round, Cachoeira is going to put it on her, man, and she does have the power to be able to put her out. 3 of Cachoeira's last 4 wins are by knockout as well, which is not always something you see in the women's division. Eubanks does usually go to decision, but like I said, is fairly durable, and Cachoeira has that power. So I said straight up at the beginning of this that I think there's a good chance this goes to a decision, and I bet the over 2.5. However, if round 3 KO comes in around, I don't know, 1,400, 1,600, I mean, these things can get crazy sometimes. I think it could be worth a shot on Cachoeira round 3 KO. So that's number 1. Second one I'm going to go with, this is a fight I've gone back and forth on a little bit, and I'm still not sure exactly how I feel about it going, but what I know is that I'm interested in the specific round prop here, and that's Charles Johnson round 3. I was playing around with KO round 3 specifically, but I'm going to go just with round 3 because submissions are live here as well. So Jimmy Flick has been away for 2 years. If you go look at Jimmy Flick's record, you will, if you're a fan, if you're someone like me who doesn't have a deep, years old knowledge of the MMA game, especially outside of UFC, you're not going to recognize many names on his record. He hasn't beat people for the most part who you're going to recognize in the UFC for the last few years. He is a submission artist, and so he absolutely could be live for a submission here. But I think the thing is here, Charles Johnson is a really experienced fighter. And from everything that I've heard and what I've seen, I mean, he had that fight against Muhammad Mokaev where he didn't get choked out, despite being in terrible positions almost the entire fight. So that just shows me that he's probably going to be able to hang in there. And while there's a chance that Jimmy Flick gets a submission, I was thinking about Flick's submission 1 earlier on this week, but the more I looked at it, the more I just feel like Johnson probably doesn't get subbed. Johnson tends to start slow and then come on later. While Jimmy Flick potentially fades, I heard someone say that they think he kind of cashes out if he knows he's not going to be able to win. I don't know if that's true or not. What I feel more confident in is that Charles Johnson is going to come on. Jimmy Flick has been finished by KO in 3 of his last 11 fights. 2 of those were in round 2 and 1 was in round 3. Those are the only 3 fights that he lost. So every time he's lost by KO. The wins that Johnson has by finish are rounds 5, 2, and 2. 2 of those were knockouts and 1 was a submission. So, well, 2 of them are round 2. That's not the last round. It isn't round 1. It's round 2 and then a round 5 as well. So I think that Johnson is really live to be in some bad positions, but do enough to stay out of trouble in the first round and maybe even a couple minutes into the second, then start to turn the tide. And I can definitely see him getting Flick out of there in round 3. So again, we'll see what the line is, but that is one I will definitely be looking at. The next one is potentially on a fighter, but it might just be on a round no matter who wins, and that is Mateusz Rebecki. I'm going to be straight up with you here. Skip what I have to say about this if you want, because I have not seen this guy fight. And I know that'll drive some people crazy, which is why I say skip this if you want to. I've heard a few people now talk about him and the way that he fights. And I've also looked through all of his statistics and stuff. This guy just smashes. 9 of his 17 pro fights have finished in the first round. And the records of the guys that he beat actually weren't terrible. Some of them were bad early on, but more recently, the guys have had respectable records, and he's still getting some of those guys out of there in the first round. Only 2 of his 17 fights have gone to the scorecards, so he's not going to decision hardly at all. Now he's getting Fiore here in this fight, who has fought absolutely no one. However, 6 out of his 6 pro bouts, in other words, all 6, have finished in round 1. This guy's just been a round 1 machine, and he's won all those fights. Well, what does it look like when he doesn't win? We don't know, but he's going up against a hammer this week. And so I like Rebecca round 1. I also, depending on the line, would be interested just in this fight to finish in round 1, regardless of who wins, in case Fiore is a little bit better than people are expecting. My last prop here is going to be Sean Strickland in round number 5. Now, have to give the caveat here that Strickland is a short notice replacement and he just fought before the break. So he's had a little bit of time off, but not a ton. And he lost a decision to Jared Cannonier in that fight. Strickland, we know what he is at this point, right? He is going to just stay on the feet and he's going to box you and strike with you. And he's a good striker. He does get hit some, which can be problematic. And Imavov can hit people. I mean, early on against Buckley, he was kind of touching him up. And so Imavov definitely has the ability to put Strickland down in the first couple rounds here. But Strickland got put down by Pereira, who is just an astronomically accurate power puncher. I don't think Strickland gets put down here by Imavov, and I could be wrong, but I think this is a big step up in competition for Imavov, and he gassed against Buckley and then just held on, and that was in a 3-round fight. Strickland is going to just put a pace on you and keep coming and not stop. He's not going to go away. He's always going to be in front of you throwing punches, and he's not a one-punch guy, so it's just going to be an accumulation of damage over time. Now, will Strickland be out of shape and not able to put a pace on Imavov? That is possible, and if that happens, this bet is probably not a great one. But if he's in any semblance of shape and can keep up the kind of pace that he normally does, then I think he's able to come forward, and as long as he doesn't get knocked out in the first 2 rounds, get Imavov tired, keep the pace on him, pile up damage, and over time, eventually be able to get him out of there. The reason I'm going with round 5, I mean, I thought about round 3, 4, 5, and you may want to think about all 3 of those rounds as well. But the reason I'm going with round 5 is because Imavov has not been knocked out in his pro career. And Strickland isn't a power puncher. So I don't think Strickland's likely to catch him with something and get him out of there. Imavov's really going to have to gas and have this damage accumulate. So generally, the round 5 prop is going to be at a much better price than 4 and 4 more than 3. So I will look at the prices there. I actually think round 4 is probably a good look as well. But if the number's really big on round 5, then I will probably look that direction, as I think eventually, if Strickland is in his best form, he is able to pile up damage and get Imavov out of there in this spot. That's going to wrap it up for this week's version of the Big Tasty Sports podcast. Hope that you enjoyed the different things that were going on. Hope you have a great week and weekend betting, whatever the sports are that you are betting on. As always, would greatly appreciate if you could rate and review if you're listening to the podcast, drop a like, subscribe to the channel. We're going to be having the weekly podcast with lots of different sports coming, so that way you will know when it's out if you like to go the YouTube route. You can find me on Twitter at NBA Attack with 1A. It's on the screen if you're watching, and if you're not, NBA TTACK, to stay up to date with anything that is coming out that way. I appreciate you listening. Have a great week, and I will talk to you again next one.